المايك لازم يكون قريب يعني. لا لا زي ما عايز.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending this session. In the UAE, we recognize that the building sector is a significant source of energy consumption and the main contributor to the generated GHG emission. The growing population, economic growth, and rising urbanization trends are increasing the demand for energy required for the buildings and construction sector, which are responsible for 36% of final energy demand globally and represented 39% of energy and process-related emissions. Accordingly, achieving the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals will be challenging without decarbonizing the building and construction sector. The need to decarbonize the building sector and develop a roadmap to support the Arab countries in achieving Paris Agreement goals was one of the outcomes of the third Arab Ministerial Forum on Housing and Urban Development held in the UAE in 2019. The initiative received unanimous consent from the Arab countries, and the UAE took the lead in developing the roadmap. The Arab Roadmap is based on the structure and the methodology of the Global ABC Roadmap for Building and Construction 2020-2050. The roadmap assesses the 8 activities following the global ABC methodology, where each activity represents a segment of the buildings and construction sector and represent an essential ingredient of how building influence the environment. These activities are urban planning, new buildings, existing buildings, building operations, appliances and systems, materials, resilience, and finally, clean energy. The roadmap is developed to serve all the 22 Arab countries, taking into consideration the diversity of the Arab region with the various climatic, economic, demographic, energy emission, and urbanization patterns. The roadmap with the sub-roadmaps shall act as a blueprint for the Arab countries to initiate, support, and complement their ambitions to decarbonize the built environment through 2050 by utilizing the considerable number of instruments provided within the roadmap to support decarbonizing each activity. In addition, the roadmap directly serves the achievement of the SDG 3, 7, 11, 12, and 13, besides its indirect impact on the other SDGs. Finally, the roadmap will be handed over to the Arab League for their action and to communicate it with the concerned countries to be the base for them to develop their national roadmaps. Now, I'll leave the floor to Mr. Riyal from Guidehouse, our partner in developing this roadmap, to elaborate on the technical details. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Engineer Esma. So I have the honor to speak about the roadmap and try to highlight some details that we came up with. Some results will be presented. Let me take this. So the structure of my presentation are 4 chapters. A brief introduction, scope and objectives, a brief intro on the methodology that we have used, then talking about the main results that we came up with, and then I will end with a conclusion. So Esma already introduced the assignment, so to say, that we have been working on, and again, thank you for your generous support and cooperation in this regard. The idea was to really a deep dive in the pretty heterogeneous region that we looked on, 22 countries, so covering Morocco from the west till the east, the Gulf countries, and some African countries, Djibouti, Somalia, Sudan, which I even was personally aware that they are part of the Arab countries before. So that were pretty different countries. And we tried to reflect this heterogeneity. So the idea was not to have one Arab roadmap, but really reflect different starting points. Therefore, we have slightly adapted the methodology that has been used in the other regional roadmaps to the region of these Arab countries. Okay, what have we done? We firstly pre-scanned, so to say, the available documentation in the region and really have a broader idea on where do each country stands. And then we have done a kind of mapping exercise, not to assess the development phases per se, but rather to be able to cluster the region in order to find three different stages of development and took from that three representative countries to have the deep dive in the regional roadmap. Afterwards, we developed the roadmap along the global APC methodology on the basis of these three countries that we have selected. Of course, representative or standing for the three different development phases. The main results we came up with were several, but I will mention 5. For us, it's key to start with a baseline in order to develop a roadmap, because actually the starting points in the region are really super different. You can't compare the efforts that have been already through UAE with, for instance, Somalia or Sudan. So there are obviously different starting points. Therefore, also the actions that have to be taken in the countries are different. Then we filtered a little bit the measures that have been already in the template and adapted to the climate conditions in the region. Then on the basis of this 3 representative countries, we did a deep dive regarding these measures that we have looked into. And each measure and, so to say, each activity, and sub-activity has been drawn into sub-regional, sub-roadmaps, so to say. So we, for instance, taking the example of a building code, we try to explain as well what steps needs to be taken to develop a building code. For instance, in Sudan, there is no energy efficiency building code available. So there are starting points, tasks that need to be done. I will deep dive into the results in the coming slides. So, yeah, like I said, so we did first of all a mapping exercise. So this color code is just illustrative, don't get it wrong. But definitely there are different levels in GDP that also influences, of course, the development. There are different strategies that have been drawn. So we collected approximately 10 indicators to be able to assess the starting point in the different countries. And then we came up with 3 categories: advanced countries, medium countries, and early starters. We mentioned that. But the main aim was not to do the mapping exercise like this. It was about trying to really display the heterogeneity or the diversification in the development phases of that region. Then we followed more or less the principles that have been already given in the template, with the 8 activities that have been mentioned already by my colleague, engineer Esma. So urban buildings, new buildings, etc. If you know the templates, you're pretty aware of what activities are available. What we have done, oppositely to the template, we have dedicated specific chapters for the enablers. So because we found it looks a little bit redundant to keep them in all the sub-chapters available. So we dedicated specific chapters there and summarized, so to say, the enablers in each chapter. Okay, you see, we came up with something around 100 measures that we have looked into for the 3 development phases. And in detail, each activity chapter looks like the following. So you see, we have in the beginning the key actions that are explained, kind of summary. Then we have, of course, also the relevant stakeholders per activity. Then we have developed an aggregated roadmap and as well came up with best practices relevant for the region. The roadmap itself also follows the template. So, of course, starting with the definition of the activity. So, what do we mean with, for instance, a building code, or what do we mean with thermal insulation? Then we have mapped that. What does that mean in the specific region or cluster? So, what does that mean in Sudan? What are the U values, if there are any? Or what are the U values in UAE, for instance? Then we have described, so to say, what do they need to do to get to net zero, starting from their specific starting point, so to say. And we came up with, so to say, the next steps per development phase. Just as an example, this is, so to say, showing, so to say, the efforts we have done on existing buildings. And like I said already, early starter representative back then was Sudan. There is no energy efficiency building code ready, so they really need to start with the first tasks to kick it off, so to say. And that means they need to have a plan how to set this up. They need to look into the reference buildings they have, and they need to assess where do they stand, what are the building habits. For instance, in medium countries or moderate countries, normally there are building codes available. Normally they tackle firstly only new buildings, so they need to introduce as well existing buildings into their building codes, and then take it from there. In advanced countries, the topic of existing buildings is definitely available, but there the ambitions need to be shaped towards net zero building standards, so they need to really increase their ambition there. Yes. In a summary, each activity was summarized in this aggregated roadmap, so to say, per activity, showing, so to say, the crucial steps to get to net zero. And on the bottom, you see the realistic timeline per development phase. So, for instance, for the advanced countries, we hope and foresee that a net zero standard is realistically doable till 2050, while for early starters, that would be too ambitious probably, and they will need more time, for instance. That's different between or no, that's for each activity different. And we try to be as realistic as possible there. To conclude, we follow definitely the global ABC logic as good as possible, but adapted it to the region and the regional concerns and needs, actually. Secondly, we think that the starting point and the illustration of a starting point is crucial when you develop a roadmap. Then the roadmap with its more than 100 activities or measures really offers a kind of blueprint to the region, and each country really can still adapt then what measure is relevant or interesting for their own needs there. And the report is enriched with regional, mainly regional best practices. So there are already things that you can rely on and refer to, and this task has been done already in several countries. I think that was the last slide, and I'm open for questions.
Hi. Hi, hello, I'm Melia Lazli from Decarbon and Salus Global Green Building. Thank you for explaining the roadmap. I have two questions. So the first one is now what are the next steps for you? And, the second one is if I'm an actor from the construction sector, how do I know what should I do? Because it's general recommendations, no?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Okay, starting with the first question. So the next step, like engineer Asma said, this is done on behalf or in connection with the League of Arab States. So this report will be shared with the League of Arab States, and they will share it with the member countries. and then they will take it from there. So ideally, there will be national roadmaps developed on the basis of this, but this is just a toolbox, so to say, and they can use the good ideas from it, and then take it further. And the second question was, of course, there are a lot of stakeholders in the field of built environment, and in each country there need to be a participative approach to really reach that goal. So you need to bring in all the relevant players. Of course, the public sector will play a crucial role, but as the private sector, R&D, I don't want to name them. So, but I think a roadmap can be only feasible or practical if it's done in the specific national context. Therefore, the national parties need to take it further. I hope I take Jonathan.
Okay. I'm going to have some questions that are more related to the process. So, and one question I had is, you mentioned about energy building codes in a certain number of countries. I'm wondering how many countries actually have moved to mandatory energy building codes. I mean, and I know also, I was discussing earlier with Egypt yesterday evening, actually we were discussing and saying that the codes are there, but the implementation or enforcement of the codes is one of the major issues. So that's one question, just to understand a little bit better, where they stand in terms of the building energy codes. And then I'm wondering also in terms of the data and how difficult it was, because I know that from other experiences with roadmaps, the data is very much challenging, and certainly for a number of the areas, especially when we look at the materials part, for example. So that also I would like to know how you maybe overcame some of those elements. And the last point I would like to ask is, to what extent did you manage to engage with a number of stakeholders in the countries to actually develop the roadmap? So these are my three.
Well, I already forgot the first one though, so I start with the reversed order. So stakeholders, we have partly looked into it and talked to them, but this is really a more desk-based study to set, so to say, guiding principles for this huge region. In order to make it work, we had to do it, so to say, rather top-down than really bottom-up. But we had a local partner, RICRI, and they had reached out to the countries and so to say gathered the data and talked as well to the huge variety of stakeholders. So Green Building Council were involved, research center were involved, architects, project developers were involved, mainly involved also because of the data gathering. Because as you could imagine, so we have taken this 22 countries and simplified, so to say, with this approach that I just explained. So we have clustered them in the development phases and took in one specific country as representative per development phase. So I can highlight that. So UAE was, so to say, in the advanced group, Egypt in the moderate phase, and Sudan as the early starter, so to say. Luckily, RICRI has connections in all the three countries, and UAE is, of course, as our partner as well, a good data source for us. So we relied on direct connections, because in the internet per se, for Sudan you find nothing. So we really reach out directly to the context in the country. That was the data gathering, and that was the stakeholder. The first question was?
First question was on energy building codes. Just wondering to what extent it's covered in the countries, and to what extent, how many countries have actually moved to mandatory building codes? Because if you look at, if you really want to make a difference, actually the mandatory building codes are critical.
Absolutely.
I mean, Europe has had voluntary building codes in most of the countries for a long time. It didn't have any impact. It's actually when they became mandatory that actually you really start to see the impacts of the building codes.
Absolutely. Absolutely, I can echo this. I don't have a clear number on how many mandatory building codes are available, but roughly, I would say on paper, definitely 50% of the countries have mandatory codes. And exactly what you say, on paper, is far away from reality. And I have other projects that I'm ongoing, and enforcement is really crucial. And I would say besides the Gulf countries, they're doing better there in this regard. even Tunisia, which is claiming, and I'm Tunisian, I know that from heart, claiming that they have the building code already for a while. Egypt has its building code since 2006. But in my other projects, I'm talking to project developers, architects, they're even not aware that something exists like a building code. So there's still a lot to do, and that's why I don't want to challenge the countries too far with the whole life cycle. I know that's crucial, but we need to do first the first baby steps in some countries. So that's still a lot to do actually to promote or to push this topic in this region. Other questions?
If there are no other questions, I will have one.
Go for it.
What are some of the key points put forward actually for the countries that are the ones that have to start from scratch? So the ones that have not yet actually moved in the sector, like the Sudan you were mentioning, or maybe Somalia. So where do they need to start?
Okay, so I would rely there on a nice theory, which is also I think presented already in the template. So the so-called policy design cycle. So first of all, it needs to be really a clear vision for the government. So there need to be a political will to put it on the agenda. If that's not available, then it's really difficult to push that sector in the right direction. After having that vision, a clear strategy needs to be formulated. So really with clear steps, action plans that can be implemented then. Then the implementation, of course, is crucial. So you really have to have that institution that takes care of that regulative framework, but you also need to build in the private sector there. And of course, at the same time, energy prices, one of the biggest barrier, hardly subsidized in several countries. They need to reflect or allow energy efficient measures to be also cost beneficial, because if that's not a business case, no project developer will go for it if there's no incentives which supports that. So it needs to be a lot of things to be done actually to tackle this. And roughly I have sketched, so to say, a diagram. So Sudan needs to have more than 100 measures to push it, while UAE maybe only has to have 30 key measures to push it. So there's a really huge disparity in terms of where do I stand and where I want to go. Any question? No question? All good. All good? So, questions? If there are no more questions, I'd like to thank you. If you have questions, I'm here. I'm all yours. And many thanks for your attendance. Thank you.